This week we're taking a look at some of the key issues in Chapter 5 in the Shaw textbook, which focuses on media and culture. So what we want to do right now is just briefly review the overall contents in Chapter 5. Today's video is going to be relatively short because I'm going to largely focus actually on the supplemental essays and not so much on the chapter contents in and of itself, because those contents I think are really easy and self-explanatory, and I think the editors do a good job. Um, so when you look at the table of contents and you've worked your way all the way through Chapter 5, you'll see that they've arranged it around six themes. Pulled up my table of contents here, opening with digital technologies, and then television, movies, contemporary music videos, print media, and then the last area they'll look at is literature and arts. Now, on the formal PowerPoint presentation that is uploaded, you'll see that I do have the appropriate, oh, hold on one second, my cat is about to come in. I'm going to pause and tell my cat to go away. Sorry about the cat interruption. I usually film these in the office. My spouse is working in the office, working from home with COVID-19. Okay. As I was saying, when I make these videos, I condense the PowerPoints, right? And the full Chapter 5 PowerPoints have already been uploaded, and you'll see that I have reviewed the definition of popular culture, right, and why it is important, and why it's important to know how we differentiate popular culture, let's say, from an older understanding of high and formal culture. And culture is around us all the time. Okay? And this chapter is getting us to think and look at culture a little differently through a critical lens. The very beginning takes a very close look at digital technologies. Okay? But as I have already told you, I want to take a look now at largely the supplemental essays. Okay, so I want to have us focus actually on Virginia Woolf. The very first assigned supplemental essay is called Thinking About Shakespeare's Sister. So before I talk about that essay, let's give you a little background on who Virginia Woolf was and why this essay is so important in the larger scheme of this chapter and in terms of women artists and literature. So Virginia Woolf was a British writer, a feminist, and she was writing at the turn of the 20th century in the 19 teens and the 1920s, all the way up until her death in the early 1940s. And some of you might already be familiar with her if you've studied literature. Now, Virginia Woolf was asked, as you read in this very brief excerpt, this is just an excerpt out of a larger chapter, a chapter titled Thinking About Shakespeare's Sister. And this chapter comes from a book that she wrote in 1929. And the book itself was called A Room of One's Own. A Room of One's Own. And that was a collection of essays. Okay? So, at that point, Woolf had already written several novels, and she was a well-known writer at that time. Again, if you study literature, English literature in particular, you might know that she was part of the Bloomsbury circle of new modern writers in London. So Woolf was asked to give a formal lecture at Oxford College. And this was an incredible honor, right? To be asked to give a formal lecture at Oxford. And that would be a very prestigious honor for anyone, much less a woman. I point that out because at that time period, women were not allowed to go to Oxford. There were only certain colleges that women could go to. So this was a big deal. And as she started to prepare her lecture, they asked her to write on the topic of women and literature. And she discusses this in the essay that you were asked to read, right? Thinking about Shakespeare's sister. She talks about how difficult it was for her to even begin to approach this topic, women and literature. Where to start, how to go about doing this. Because there it was, she was living in the early 20th century, and there were so few published female authors at that time period. So few of them, right? And the representations that she saw of women all throughout history were not realistic representations of women's lives. And they had largely been written by men, of course, and they were not accurate representations of women. They were incredibly limited. So this got her thinking about the actual conditions of women's lives, the actual lived conditions, the material conditions that women endure if they are artists, if they wanted to be an artist, if they wanted to write, would it even be possible for them? Living in patriarchal worlds, living in worlds that denied women in education, living in places that said, women, you have no value. Why should we give you an education? And what would you have to contribute to that? How could that female artist even find the time to create? And what would that art look like? So these are the issues she's tackling. And she came up with, right? So this essay is dealing with these two tensions. And so she came up with an imaginary figure, right? And she writes about the possibility. She said, imagine if William Shakespeare had a sister and her name was Judith, and she was just as talented as Shakespeare. What would her life have been like? And that is why we see her essay, thinking about Shakespeare's sister. And that's what that essay is all about. And she, as a writer, chronicles what those material conditions would have most likely been like, right? She would have been completely discouraged from ever getting an education. She would never have any of the opportunities her brother would have had. And in fact, she ends up taking her own life, right? So let's take a look at what I always think is one of the most significant passages. It's on page 251. This is really at the very end of the excerpt we have of Thinking About Shakespeare's Sister, where she writes, she's writing in present day being 1929. She has left the fictional world of Judith Shakespeare behind, and she's addressing her contemporaries and acknowledging how difficult it is for women artists to find their grounding in the world around them because they have so little support. So she says at the top of page 251, she writes, quote, "But for women, I thought, looking at the empty shelves," she's referring to the bookshelves where there are no books by women authors. "I thought, looking at those empty shelves, these difficulties were infinitely more formidable. In the first place, to have a room of her own, let alone a quiet room or a soundproof room, was out of the question, unless her parents were exceptionally rich or very noble, even up to the beginning of the 19th century. Since her pin money, which depended on the goodwill of her father, was only enough to keep her clothed, she was debarred from such alleviations as came even to Keats or Tennyson or Carlyle. All poor men, from a walking tour, a little journey to France, from the separate lodging which, even if it were miserable enough, sheltered them from the claims and tyrannies of their families." So she's giving very good examples that all the famous men that you've heard of, writers and poets, right? They have found ways to escape the demands of the world. And then she ends, "Such material difficulties were formidable. But much worse was the immaterial, the indifference of the world, which Keats and Flaubert and other men of genius have found so hard to bear. Was in her case, it was not indifference, but hostility. The world did not say to her, as it said to them, 'Write if you choose, it makes no difference to me.' The world said with a guffaw, 'Write? What's the good of your writing?' So while the world might say to men, 'You can write, we don't care if you write,' we can be indifferent to it. But to women, they say, 'What's the good of you writing? What do you have to say? You're nothing.' Very different. So I have put on the screen here, on this slide, right, one of my favorite quotes here by Virginia Woolf. Okay. Lock up your libraries if you like, because she was indeed, as a woman, barred from some of the best libraries in all of Great Britain at the top universities. But there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind." Now, we're going to transition and take a look at the writings of Audre Lorde. And I so appreciate that the authors put these two writings of our textbook, right? The editors put these two writings back to back. Okay? So, since this whole chapter has us exploring, right, the different ways women artists can express themselves, the challenges they have faced trying to express themselves in art and culture, right? Audre Lorde, as a poet, is going to do some wonderful and fascinating things in her piece that we're going to take a look at. Poetry is not a luxury. So to aid in this transition, excuse me, I pulled two great quotes. Right, the first is Woolf. "Women have always been poor, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time. Women, then, have not had a dog's chance of writing poetry. That is why I have laid so much stress on money and a room of one's own." Room of one's own. Now, if you had near you, and you can go look at this, right? Your syllabus, right? You'll find probably around page 6 or so, there's going to be a picture of a picture of Virginia Woolf, and another quote there where she is saying, I would venture to gain, right? Or bet that so many poems written by a non were probably written by a woman. And she's talking about the fact that she believes that many of the poems that we see written by anonymous were probably written by a woman because they couldn't get it published in their own name. So we see a couple references here to what she has talked about. Remember that essay, Shakespeare's Sister, came from her book titled A Room of One's Own. So she genuinely believes that a artist, women in particular, need to be financially independent. So they are not relying on someone else to support them, and they need a studio. They need a space of their own to work. So here we have Audre Lorde. We're going to go take a look at Poetry is Not a Luxury. And you know Lorde. You've already read some of her prose, right? There's no hierarchy of oppression, right? Civil rights activist, lesbian poet, great writer, known for both her essays. And what we hear with her as well is we see her suggesting always stand up for your rights. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So, in the short piece, Poetry is Not a Luxury. Right? In this essay, Lorde is explaining her passion for writing poetry and how essential poetry is for women's empowerment. Right? Instead of people making the argument that, oh, poetry is fluff. Oh, maybe it's a luxury. She says, no, not at all. It is essential. Okay. I asked students rhetorically to think about how you might define poetry. Because many times students come to class and some have great experiences with poetry. They love writing poems themselves. Others have bad experience. They remember having to diagram poems and things. So I like students to just kind of think about poetry and how you can define it. Lorde argues that for women, poetry is a vital necessity for our existence. Poetry is the light on which hope is predicated, and dreams of survival and change are articulated into language, and then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we give name to the nameless so it can be thought. And that's one of the most amazing and beautiful things about poetry. You come across a phrase, the way someone has articulated something. They've been able to put into words a feeling about something, and you think, wow, that's phenomenal, right? They've given name to the nameless so it can be thought. So for her, poetry has the potential to unleash revolutionary freedom through language and expression. Through language and expression. So one particular quote I'll point out to you on page 252. One, two. I'm looking for it is on the right hand column, 232. She said, the white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. The black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. Poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary demand, the implementation of that freedom. So this is a key paragraph here. It is a rejection of Enlightenment rationalism, right? It's going back to Descartes of the Enlightenment, right? Who said, well, I think, therefore I am. That's a very rational way of understanding the world, right? The white father said, I think, therefore I am. And she's flipping that on its head and saying the black mother within all of us says, I feel, therefore, right? I am. And therefore I can be free, right? And that is radically liberating, right? Because so often, right, women have been told what your feelings and how you interpret and how you understand the world is invalid. She says, no, it's just the opposite. That is what gives us meaning. Embrace that. Okay. All right. So this is why, part of the reason why I absolutely love her. I think she's just fantastic. Lord, right, argues that the harshness of the world, the structures defined by profit, by linear power, by institutional dehumanizations, right, all the harshness in the world was designed to crush women's feelings. However, women survived, okay, and specifically, women survived as poets. So for her, the key to women's survival is finding as she says, the places of possibility within all women where the power to create and describe reality emerges. So this is where she finds a way to resist all that is being put upon us. An absolutely beautiful, beautiful essay. One other key aspect before we head out here for tonight is illustrating, right, the very prominent feminist argument that the film theorist Laura Mulvey identified way back in the 1980s. She came up with the concept of the male gaze, right? This motive for understanding gender in film. Okay? And she argues that movies are essentially made through and for the male gaze, right? The eyes, right? And the male gaze helps fulfill a voyeuristic desire for men to look at women as objects. And the videos that I have posted these past couple of weeks have allowed you to see very good examples of that. The Jean Kilbourne video gave you a lot of representations of the male gaze in media. seeing women constantly objectified and misrepresentation, particularly the Hollywood segment gave you great examples of the male gaze, right? There's so much media where the camera lens is constantly looking at women as if we're all, adolescent boys. So, finally, do make sure that you watch in the original video of PowerPoint that I uploaded for chapter 5, that very good, there's like a 4-minute clip from YouTube. Well, it was on the root, um, about Cardi B and hip hop feminism, taking a look at contemporary music. Okay. So I hope this has helped give you some insight into different ways women have used their art to express themselves. And I hope you have found this intriguing and enjoyable. All right. Have a good day.